Welcome to Fiery Nights, where the darkest stories unfold in the stillness of the night. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you safely curled up in your room or perhaps surrounded by the noise of others? Or maybe you find yourself in a quiet, haunting place alone with your thoughts and the whispers of something far more sinister. Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in. Tonight's tale will take you into the heart of darkness, a place where the line between the living and the dead is thin, and the silence is deafening. Story 1. Long ago, a train line known as the Harrow Line Express ran through the outskirts of a small, quiet town. The tracks stretched endlessly into the horizon, and the train, a relic of the past, was a symbol of movement and progress. But there was one train that everyone avoided, the Midnight Harrow Line. It was a train that no one could explain, and its mystery grew with each passing year. The Midnight Harrow Line was always on time, but it was never seen during the day. It only appeared at midnight, when the rest of the world was asleep. The train came from nowhere, its lights dim and flickering, its engine rumbling in the distance long before it appeared at the station. Those who had seen it describe it as a ghostly shadow, an old-fashioned locomotive seemingly abandoned, with broken windows and a trail of mist that followed it like smoke. But the most unsettling part of the Midnight Harrow Line was that it never stopped. No matter how many passengers waited at the platform, the train would simply pass by, its doors never opening, its whistle echoing through the night, yet it never slowed. It was said that anyone who tried to board the train was lost forever. At least that's what the locals whispered. One fateful night, a curious traveler named Eliza arrived in town. Unaware of the strange reputation of the Midnight Harrow Line. She had heard the stories, of course, but thought them nothing more than superstition. Intrigued by the tales of the train that never stopped, she decided to witness it for herself. Eliza stood at the platform, waiting as the clock struck midnight. The cold air was thick with anticipation, and the town was eerily silent. Her breath misted in the chill as she stared down the tracks, eyes fixed on the distant lights that were just beginning to appear. The train appeared as it always did, slowly at first, its dim lights flickering in the dark. The ground trembled beneath her feet as the sound of the engine grew louder. Her pulse quickened. She had read the stories, but there was still something terrifying about seeing it for herself. The train came closer, its wheels grinding against the rails, its whistle piercing the stillness. As it reached the platform, the air grew colder and a strange, almost magnetic force seemed to pull her toward it. She stepped forward instinctively, compelled by some unseen force. The train's doors remained closed, but the feeling that something was watching her, something waiting, was overwhelming. Eliza reached out, her hand almost touching the door handle, when the train suddenly shuddered. The platform was now completely silent, as though time itself had stopped. The Midnight Harrow Line passed by her, as it always did. The doors remained locked, the windows dark and empty. She blinked, but in the brief moment she closed her eyes. The train had disappeared into the night, leaving only a faint trail of fog. She stumbled back in disbelief, the sounds of the train's departure fading into the distance. But she wasn't alone. There were other figures standing at the platform now, silent, watching her. They were dressed in clothes from a bygone era, their faces pale and eyes hollow, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Before she could move, the air grew heavy with dread. One of the figures stepped closer, its voice low and rasping. "You're next." The town fell into an unnatural stillness, and the train had vanished, but Eliza wasn't sure if it had really gone or if it had just shifted out of time. The people at the platform were gone too, leaving her alone in the silence. She tried to leave, but every road she took seemed to lead her back to the station. The streets were unfamiliar, and each corner seemed to twist in on itself. The town, which had seemed so normal, now felt like a trap, an endless loop, and she was the latest to fall victim to it. It wasn't long before Eliza found herself standing at the same platform again, just as the midnight Harrow line returned. She watched as the train approached, but this time the doors did not stay shut. They were open, waiting, and then she understood. The midnight Harrow line was not a train bound for any station. It was a train bound for the lost souls. Story to the town of Harrow's Hollow had always been quiet, a place where time seemed to slow, and the past lingered in the air like an old memory. Among the town's many oddities, there was one that people would never discuss openly, but was the subject of hushed whispers in every corner: the Midnight Express. It was a train that never stopped, a train that passed through the town at exactly midnight without fail, its distant whistle cutting through the thick night air. But no one could ever explain its purpose. It had no scheduled stops. It never picked up passengers. It simply passed by. The first person to speak of the Midnight Express was Josephine Walker, a writer who had come to the town seeking inspiration for a novel. She rented a small room at the local inn, overlooking the tracks, curious about the train that had haunted the town for years. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than a local legend, just another ghost story to keep children inside at night. But as the days passed, something about it intrigued her. Something about the way the train's lights appeared each night, moving through the fog like a shadow, drew her in. One evening, Josephine decided to sit at the station, waiting for the train to appear. She didn't know why. She just felt an overwhelming need to see it with her own eyes. The station, a dusty old structure, seemed to belong to another time, like it had been abandoned long ago, but never truly left. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, its hands creeping toward midnight. As the clock struck 12, a distant whistle sounded in the night, and Josephine's heart skipped. The air around her seemed to still, the town's usual sounds silenced by the approaching train. The Midnight Express appeared in the distance, its headlights piercing the fog that rolled across the tracks. It was exactly as she had imagined, an old-fashioned locomotive, steam pouring from its sides, its engine groaning as it slowly approached. But there was something wrong about it, something off. The train seemed too quiet, almost unreal, moving too smoothly for something of its size. It passed by the station without slowing, and Josephine could see the windows were black, empty, like hollow eyes staring back at her. But the strangest thing happened as the train passed. A figure stood in one of the windows, a silhouette, blurred and distorted like a shadow of someone long gone. For a moment she could have sworn it looked directly at her, and her pulse quickened. But then the train was gone, gone as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing into the mist as though it had never been there at all. Josephine returned to her room, unsettled, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the train had been calling to her, beckoning her in some way. That night she dreamt of the train again. The figure in the window was clearer this time, its face pale and emotionless, staring at her with an expression that seemed to say, "You're next." The next few nights were no different. The train arrived at midnight, its ghostly presence haunting the station, but Josephine couldn't bring herself to stop watching. She sat at the window, waiting for the shadow to appear in the window just as it had before. And then it happened. The train didn't just pass. This time, it stopped. The midnight whistle echoed louder than before, and the train came to a screeching halt right in front of the station. The doors creaked open, but there were no passengers, no conductor, only an unnatural silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The door, heavy and ancient, swung open by itself, inviting her in. Josephine stood there, frozen. The temperature had dropped sharply. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive weight, as though the train was not just a train, but something more, something alive. The distant sound of footsteps echoed from the train, though no one was in sight. It was then that she saw it, another figure standing at the far end of the platform waiting for her. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure from her dreams. The pale face, the hollow eyes now clear as day. It was no illusion. Before she could move, the figure spoke. "Come aboard," it whispered, its voice low and raspy, like the sound of something trapped in the deepest part of the earth. Josephine's legs moved on their own, carrying her toward the train. The air grew colder with each step, the fog thickening as if to swallow her. She reached the train, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a violent force pulled her inside. The door slammed shut behind her, locking her in. Inside, the train was just as she had imagined, a long, darkened corridor with faded curtains hanging from the windows. The seats were empty, save for the shadows that seemed to fill every corner, moving as though they were alive. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, rust, and dust. Suddenly, the train began to move, lurching forward with a terrifying speed, faster than any train should go. The lights flickered, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to grow and shrink with each passing second. Josephine stumbled down the aisle, trying to make sense of what was happening. But everything felt distorted. The world outside the window had become a blur, the scenery dissolving into a swirling vortex of darkness. Then she heard the whispers. The passengers. They were in the windows, their faces pale and twisted, their eyes wide with terror. They weren't alive, not anymore, but they were waiting, just like her, trapped aboard this train that never stops. A voice came from the shadows. "You are one of us now." Josephine tried to scream, but no sound came out. The train began to move faster, the tracks stretching endlessly into nothingness. She ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it was locked tight. The train was no longer following the tracks. It was cutting through the air, through time, through reality itself. As she collapsed on the floor, breathless and sobbing, the whispers grew louder. They were all around her now, the lost souls of those who had boarded the Midnight Express and never returned. They reached for her, their cold hands brushing her skin, their hollow eyes staring into hers. The train was not a train at all. It was a prison, a cursed journey, an eternal ride through the dark and the forgotten. And now Josephine was a part of it. The train never stopped. Story 3. There was a story that had been told for years in the town of Gravestone Ridge, a town that sat quietly in the shadow of the mountains, untouched by time. The town had a railway station, but it wasn't like any other. It was old, abandoned, the tracks rusty and covered in moss. No trains had stopped there in decades. But every year, on the night of the midwinter moon, the town heard the whistle of a train that had not been seen by anyone alive. The townspeople didn't speak of it much. It was a thing whispered about at dusk, when the winds picked up, carrying a chill from the mountains. They said it was the Midnight Phantom, a train that never stopped. Those who had seen it, the few who had dared to speak of it, described it as a ghostly shadow, its metal frame glistening under the moon, its headlights casting long beams through the night. But it was more than just a train. It was a harbinger of something unseen, something forgotten. One such person was Samuel Holloway, an outsider who had recently moved into the area, intrigued by the stories of the Midnight Phantom. Samuel was a man of reason, rational, scientific, disbelieving in the supernatural. He had heard the rumors, laughed them off, and dismissed them as folk tales for children. But curiosity gnawed him. So on the night of the midwinter moon, when the first frost had settled on the ground and the stars seemed to twinkle just a bit too brightly, Samuel decided to venture to the old station and wait for the train. The clock struck midnight, and the air grew colder. Samuel stood in the middle of the forgotten platform, the silence around him suffocating. He could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional scrape of a loose board underfoot. But there was something else in the air, something unsettling. The hairs on his neck stood up, his breath coming in uneven bursts. He was being watched. A low, mournful whistle broke through the silence, sending a jolt through his body. It was faint at first, far in the distance but unmistakable. The sound sent a ripple through the cold night air, shaking the very ground beneath him. The train was coming, and this time, it was real. From the shadows, the train emerged, its shape appearing as though it were being pulled from the very fabric of the night itself. It was an old locomotive, its metal frame glinting with an eerie, unnatural sheen, despite the darkness that surrounded it. The faint blue glow of its headlights illuminated the tracks ahead, cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in. The train didn't slow as it approached, but Samuel felt an irresistible pull to step closer, as though the train was calling him. It passed by at an unsettling speed, too fast for something of its size, its wheels scraping harshly against the tracks. The whistle grew louder, almost deafening, and Samuel's heart raced. He wanted to turn away, to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The train's windows were dark, the interior shrouded in blackness, yet as it passed he could see figures moving inside, silhouettes of people, their faces pale and twisted, their eyes hollow, staring into the night with lifeless gazes. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. The passengers were no longer alive. The train carried the souls of the lost, the forgotten, the damned, and it wasn't going anywhere. Not ever. Before Samuel could react, the train stopped, right in front of him, as though it had been waiting for him all along. The doors slowly creaked open with a low, sickening groan. A cold wind rushed from the train, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rot and decay. The whistle stopped. Everything went still, and then a voice, a whisper, came from the darkness of the train. "We've been waiting for you." Samuel felt the ground beneath him tremble as though something was stirring below. His chest tightened, panic setting in, and his legs finally moved. But it was too late. The cold, skeletal hand of a figure reached out from the shadows and grabbed his wrist. The hand was ice, unyielding, its fingers long and gnarled, wrapping around him with a force that he could not escape. He was pulled toward the train. He saw the faces of the passengers closer now, their mouths opening in silent screams, their eyes pleading, but their voices unheard. The air was thick with their trapped souls, and Samuel felt his vision blur, his breath becoming shallow. The doors slammed shut with a force that shook the very foundations of the platform. The train began to move, slower now, but still at an unnatural speed, as though it had no need for tracks. Samuel was dragged into the darkness of the train, his feet stumbling, his body growing heavier with every step. The train pulled away, leaving the station behind. The whistle echoed into the night, and with it, the whispers of the lost souls filled the air, growing louder as the train sped into the abyss. Samuel's heart pounded, but he couldn't move. The train had taken him, and it would never let him go. The midnight phantom had claimed its next passenger, and as it disappeared into the mist, it left behind only an eerie silence, the tracks empty, the station desolate, awaiting the next soul foolish enough to wait. Story 4. There was a time when the Hollowbrook line was just another forgotten stretch of railway, barely marked on any map, overshadowed by the more prosperous train routes of the surrounding cities. But then the midnight train started running. It was not scheduled, nor was it welcome. Every night at exactly 12 a.m., the train would appear out of nowhere, its headlights cutting through the dense fog that always seemed to hang over Hollowbrook. The station, once quiet and desolate, would erupt with the sound of its approach. But there was one thing no one could explain. The midnight train never stopped. Those who had seen it, those who had dared to speak about it, described a train unlike any other. Its metal frame was blackened with age, its windows cracked and coated in a thick layer of grime, its steam billowing like an ancient, dying creature. The sound of its wheels grinding along the tracks echoed in the night, filling the town with a low, eerie hum. It never slowed, never paused to pick up passengers, and always continued its journey into the dark void beyond. For years, no one dared to board the train. The few brave souls who had attempted were never seen again. Their belongings would be found, left behind in the station, but their bodies, their souls, had disappeared. The town's elders, the ones who had lived through the dark days of Hollowbrook's history, spoke of a curse that had been placed on the town long ago. They said the train had always existed, a specter from another time, and that whoever boarded it was lost to the world forever. But that didn't stop David Graves, a young man who had recently moved to Hollowbrook, from investigating the mystery. He was fascinated by the town's strange legends and the haunting allure of the midnight train. To David, it was just another story, a tale to be uncovered, and nothing more. He wanted to see it for himself, to prove that it was nothing more than superstition. One crisp winter evening, David found himself standing at the old Hollowbrook station, waiting for the train. The air was thick with fog, and the platform felt more like a graveyard than a place of travel. He checked his watch. It was exactly midnight. As if on cue, he heard it. The distant low rumble of the midnight train, its whistle piercing through the cold night. David felt a strange sense of excitement, his heartbeat quickening. He hadn't expected the train to be so real, so alive. The sound grew louder, closer, and then, through the mist it appeared, black, ghostly, and looming. The train sped past him at an impossible speed, its massive wheels slicing through the fog with a sound like thunder. The lights on the train flickered as it passed, the windows dark and empty. David stood frozen, watching it vanish into the night. The eerie whistle echoed through the town, slowly fading until the train was gone. But something was different now. The station was no longer silent. A figure stood at the far end of the platform, just outside the glow of the station's lights. A man, or what looked like a man, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. He stood perfectly still, watching David with piercing, cold eyes. David felt an instinctual shiver crawl up his spine. "Did you see it?" the man asked, his voice a low rasp that carried across the empty platform. David nodded, still staring at the man. The figure's face was pale, almost sickly, his skin pulled tight over sharp bones. But his eyes, they were hollow, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. The conductor took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound on the ground. "It's a long ride, son. A ride that never ends." David's heart raced, his legs frozen in place. He wanted to speak, to ask what the man meant, but the words caught in his throat. The fog around them seemed to grow thicker, heavier, and the man's figure loomed closer. "You think the train is just a machine, a thing of metal and steel, don't you?" The man's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. "But it's not. It's a door to somewhere else. And once you board, you can never leave." David shook his head, trying to make sense of the words, but his feet wouldn't move. His body was locked in place, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure took another step forward. "Every night the midnight train comes," the conductor continued, his voice soft but growing more insistent. "It passes through Hollowbrook, through time, through life and death. And every night it collects someone who dares to wait, someone who thinks they can outrun it." The fog swirled around them now, thicker than before, and David felt a cold, heavy pressure in the air. The whispers in the fog grew louder, voices speaking in a language he didn't understand, but somehow he felt like he did. The train wasn't just a ghost, it was alive, and it was watching him, waiting. The conductor's eyes seemed to pierce through David's soul. "You've already seen it. Now you'll join it." Suddenly, the ground beneath David's feet began to tremble. The fog lifted just enough to reveal the train, its shadow looming like a predator in the night. The midnight train was back. David turned, but his legs were heavy, his body refusing to obey. The conductor reached out, his hand cold and unnaturally long, fingers stretching toward him. David's mind screamed for him to move, to run, but it was too late. The train's whistle howled again, louder, more desperate. And as the train pulled into the station once more, the platform emptied. David was gone. The only trace of him left behind was a single blackened train ticket that had slipped from his hand. In the morning, the station was silent once again, the tracks empty, and the town of Hollowbrook continued to whisper of the midnight train, a train that never stops, a train that collects those who are foolish enough to wait for it. Story 5. In the sleepy town of Ashford Crossing, there was a railway station, nestled in the heart of the town, abandoned and overgrown with weeds. The tracks had long been forgotten, as the town's residents had all but abandoned the idea of trains passing through. But there was one thing that everyone knew about Ashford Crossing: the midnight train. It wasn't a train that anyone had ever seen during the day, and it never made any stops, yet it was always there, at exactly midnight. The people in town had grown accustomed to hearing its distant whistle echoing through the valley, the steady click-clack of its wheels as it passed, the sound trailing off into the night. Some said it was a ghost train. Others said it was simply a relic of the past, a train that had once carried passengers but had long since been abandoned. No one ever spoke of it openly, but there was always the feeling that something wasn't quite right about the midnight train. It wasn't just the eerie silence that followed its passing, or the sense of unease it left in the air. There was something wrong about it, something that made the blood run cold and the heart race with fear. The train, after all, never stopped. It simply passed through Ashford Crossing, its shadow crossing over the town like a dark omen, and vanished into the darkness. No one had ever tried to board it, until one night, a traveler named Thomas Reed, a man just passing through, arrived at Ashford Crossing on a late-night journey. He had heard the whispers, of course, the ghostly tales about the midnight train. But to him, it was just another legend. He was a skeptic, a man who had no time for myths or superstitions. He was tired, hungry, and only interested in finding a place to rest for the night. He checked into a small inn near the tracks, and by the time he finished his meal and retired to his room, the clock had struck midnight. The innkeeper had warned him about the train, but Thomas had dismissed the warning with a laugh, telling the man that he was just being old-fashioned. It was then that he heard it, the distant whistle. The sound was faint at first, almost like an echo, but it grew louder, clearer, and soon the floorboards beneath him began to vibrate. He glanced out of the window and saw it, the midnight train, its lights cutting through the fog, its silhouette emerging from the darkness. It moved faster than any train should, too fast for something so heavy. For a moment, Thomas felt the strange urge to go to the station. He couldn't explain why, just an instinctive pull. He left the inn and stepped outside, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the tracks. The air was cold, too cold for a spring night. The train was approaching, its whistle now deafening in the stillness. It was nearly upon him when, without thinking, he stepped closer to the edge of the platform. The train never slowed. The doors remained shut. The figures inside the train, shadows that he could barely make out, didn't seem to move, their eyes fixed forward. The train rushed past him, the windows a blur of blackness, the sound of its wheels grinding against the tracks piercing the air like an unnatural scream. But just as the last car passed, the doors opened. Thomas felt a rush of cold air, so cold that it made his bones ache. He looked up to see that impossibly a figure stood in the doorway of the last car. It was a man, though his face was hidden in shadow, his eyes glowing with an unsettling light. The man's hands, pale and long, gripped the door frame, and his mouth twisted into an expression that Thomas could not understand. "Get on," the figure said, his voice a deep, guttural whisper that seemed to vibrate in Thomas's chest. "You're next." Thomas froze, his mind screaming to run, to flee from whatever this was, but his legs didn't obey. He felt his body moving forward, his feet carrying him toward the train. The doors were open now, and the figure stepped back, as though inviting him in. The train, though still speeding forward, seemed to stop just for him, as if time itself had bent for this moment. A force, cold and suffocating, gripped his chest as he approached the door. The train was moving again, but the motion was impossible. It felt as though he was no longer walking on the ground, but being pulled forward, trapped in a current, dragged toward the doors of the midnight train. He stepped inside. The moment he did, the doors slammed shut behind him with a sound that made the air shake. He turned around, gasping for air, but the train had already begun moving again, faster now, its speed relentless. He looked up at the figure that had greeted him. It stood in the corner, staring at him with its hollow, empty eyes, as though it had been waiting for him all along. The train rattled along the tracks, but the windows were blank. Nothing to see but an endless void, a black abyss that stretched out beyond the limits of reality. The other passengers, their faces pale and frozen, didn't move. Their eyes were fixed ahead, their bodies rigid, as though they had been there for an eternity. Thomas tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his tongue heavy. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff, locked in place as though the train had taken hold of his very soul. "Where are we going?" Thomas whispered, but no one answered. The figure in the corner simply nodded, as if to acknowledge his question, though the answer was clear. The train didn't stop. It never had, and it never would. And soon Thomas felt himself becoming like the other passengers, frozen, silent, trapped in the same endless journey, riding the midnight train, a train that never stopped. And it wasn't just a train, it was a passage, a doorway between life and death where lost souls rode forever, unable to escape. And now, Thomas was one of them.